Death comes in many forms on the frontier. Sometimes it's quick, a gunshot, a fall from a horse. But in the winter of 1893, it came slowly, wrapped in white, howling across the plains. The blizzard descended without warning, transforming the landscape into a frozen wasteland where even the bravest souls feared to tread. For Evelyn Hart, the storm wasn't just a force of nature, it was an executioner. As the temperature plummeted and the wind rattled the cabin walls, she pulled her children closer, feeling their small bodies shiver against hers. 6-year-old Abigail and 4-year-old Thomas looked up at her with eyes that held too much fear for one so young. "When is Papa coming back?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind's mournful wail. Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in her throat. "Soon," she lied, stroking his hair with trembling fingers. "Very soon." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but what choice did she have? The truth was too cruel for children to bear, that their father had been gone for 3 weeks, that the supplies were nearly gone, that the cold was becoming an enemy they might not defeat. The fire in the hearth was dying, nothing but embers now, casting long shadows across the floor. Their last log had been added hours ago, and the cold was creeping in, an invisible predator stalking its prey. Evelyn knew what awaited them if help didn't come, she had seen it before. Bodies frozen stiff, faces peaceful as if in sleep, but there would be no waking. She had tried everything. Burning furniture, old clothes, even pages from the family Bible, anything to keep the flames alive a little longer. But now there was nothing left to burn, nothing left to eat, nothing but the howling wind and the creeping cold. Have you ever faced a moment when all hope seems lost? When the odds are stacked so high against you that surrender feels like the only option? If you have, you'll understand what Evelyn felt that night. If you haven't, consider yourself fortunate, and stay with me, because this story might just save your life someday. Like this video if you've ever had to be strong for someone else when you were breaking inside. Subscribe to hear more true stories of survival against impossible odds. Evelyn Hart wasn't born to wealth or privilege. Her childhood was spent on a struggling farm in Missouri, where she learned early that life gives nothing freely. By age 12, she could plow a field, mend clothes, and cook for a family of 7. Her hands were calloused, her skin weathered by sun and wind, but her spirit remained unbroken. "You're made of stronger stuff than most men I know," her father once told her, pride evident in his voice despite their hardships. Those words echoed in her mind years later when she met Samuel Hart, a man with dreams as vast as the western sky. He spoke of land in Wyoming Territory, of building a home where their children would grow strong and free. His eyes sparkled when he talked about the future, and Evelyn found herself believing in his vision. They married in the spring of 1887, and by summer, they were heading west in a wagon packed with everything they owned. The journey was grueling, rivers to ford, mountains to cross, dangers lurking around every bend. But Evelyn never complained. This was their chance, their opportunity to create something lasting. The first winter nearly broke them. Unprepared for the brutal cold, they survived on determination alone. Evelyn still remembered the night she'd woken to find Samuel weeping silently, convinced they would die before spring. She had taken his hands in hers, her voice steady despite her own fear. "We didn't come this far to give up now," she told him. "Tomorrow, we fight harder." The land they claimed was beautiful but unforgiving. Together, they built their cabin log by log, Samuel's strength and Evelyn's determination forming a partnership that seemed unbreakable. They planted crops, raised livestock, and when Abigail was born, followed by Thomas 2 years later, their joy seemed complete. But frontier life exacts a heavy toll. Crops failed in the drought of '92. Animals sickened and died. Their savings dwindled until there was nothing left. Samuel's eyes lost their spark, replaced by a haunted look that Evelyn pretended not to notice. "I'll go to Cheyenne," he announced one morning in late November. "Get supplies, maybe find work for the winter. We'll be all right, Evie. I promise." She watched him ride away, Thomas on her hip and Abigail clutching her skirt. Something in her heart whispered that this goodbye was different, but she pushed the thought away. Samuel would return. He had to. The first week after his departure, Evelyn maintained their routine. She told the children stories about their father's adventures, assuring them he would return with presents and tales of the big city. The second week, doubt began to gnaw at her. The third week, fear took root. 3 weeks passed. Then the blizzard came. The first day of the storm, Evelyn maintained hope. Samuel was smart, he would have found shelter. The second day, doubt crept in like the cold through the cabin walls. By the third day, as the food dwindled to almost nothing and the woodpile shrank to a handful of logs, fear took hold. She rationed what little they had, a spoonful of beans for each child, nothing for herself. She tore pages from Samuel's Bible to help start the fire, apologizing silently with each sacred sheet she burned. She stuffed rags into the cracks between logs, hung blankets over the windows, anything to keep the deadly cold at bay. "Mama, I'm hungry," Abigail whimpered, her once rosy cheeks now pale and drawn. "I know, sweetheart. We need to be brave a little longer." Evelyn's stomach cramped with her own hunger, but she ignored it. A mother's pain always comes second. The children had stopped asking about their father. Perhaps they sensed the truth in the way Evelyn's eyes darted away when his name was mentioned, or in the tremor of her voice when she spoke of his return. Children understand more than adults give them credit for, especially when it comes to loss. On the fourth day, desperation drove Evelyn to attempt the impossible. Wrapping herself in every layer she could find, she kissed her sleeping children and opened the door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Snow blinded her, ice crystals stinging her face like needles. She managed 3 steps before being knocked to her knees, the cold instantly penetrating her clothes. Crawling back to the cabin, she knew the truth she'd been avoiding: they were going to die here, forgotten by God and man alike. The realization should have broken her. Instead, it awakened something primal, a mother's fierce determination to protect her young at any cost. If death was coming, she would not make it easy. She would fight until her last breath. With renewed purpose, Evelyn took inventory of what remained. Half a cup of beans. 3 small potatoes, already sprouting. A handful of flour, more weevil than grain. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it would buy them another day. And sometimes, one day makes all the difference. That night, as the children slept fitfully beside her, Evelyn allowed herself to weep silently. Not for herself, but for her children who would never grow up, never know life beyond this frozen hell. She thought of Samuel. Had he abandoned them, or had the wilderness claimed him too? The question tormented her more than the cold or hunger ever could. "Please," she whispered to whoever might be listening, "not my children. Take me if you must, but spare them." Miles away, a solitary rider urged his horse through the storm. Most men would have sought shelter days ago, but Jack Calloway wasn't most men. The jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw was just one visible mark of a life lived on the edges of civilization. The invisible scars ran deeper. Jack had been heading to Laramie when the storm hit, but something made him change course. A feeling, an instinct honed by years of surviving when others didn't. He'd passed a small homestead 3 days back, isolated and vulnerable. The image of that lonely cabin haunted him, wouldn't let him rest. "Come on, boy," he murmured to his horse, a sturdy Mustang named Diablo. "Someone's counting on us." The animal snorted, steam billowing from its nostrils, but pressed forward. Jack's face was numb, his fingers stiff inside his gloves. Ice formed on his eyelashes and in his beard. Each breath was a battle against the freezing air. But still, he rode on. Jack knew the odds. He'd seen what winter could do to the unprepared or the unlucky. Bodies found in spring thaws, preserved by the cold, expressions frozen in their final moments of desperation. He'd helped bury more than his share of winter's victims, men, women, children. The frontier didn't discriminate. Jack Calloway wasn't a man who believed in destiny or divine intervention. Life had taught him harsh lessons about relying on anything but his own two hands. The scar on his face was a daily reminder of misplaced trust, a knife wielded by a man he once called friend. That betrayal had changed him, hardened him. For 10 years, he drifted from town to town, ranch to ranch, taking work where he could find it and moving on before anyone got close. He preferred the company of horses to people, the open sky to a roof over his head. So why was he risking his life for strangers? Jack couldn't have answered if asked. He only knew that leaving them to die wasn't an option he could live with. The storm had caught him by surprise, its ferocity unlike anything he'd seen in years. He'd considered holing up in a cave he knew of, waiting it out like any sensible man would. But that cabin kept appearing in his mind's eye, isolated, vulnerable, possibly with children inside. The thought of them slowly freezing, hoping for help that never came, was more than he could bear. Have you ever followed your instincts even when logic told you to do otherwise? Drop a comment below about a time your gut feeling led you to do something unexpected. Your story might inspire others facing difficult choices. As dusk approached on that 4th day of the blizzard, Jack's hope began to falter. Visibility was near zero, and Diablo was struggling through snow that reached his chest. Then, through a momentary break in the swirling white, he saw it, a dark shape against the endless white. The cabin. Relief surged through him, followed immediately by concern. No smoke rose from the chimney. In this cold, that could mean only one thing. Faster, he urged Diablo, though the loyal animal was already giving everything he had. The last quarter mile was the hardest. The wind seemed determined to push them back, as if the storm itself were a living entity protecting its prey. Jack's face burned with cold, his lungs aching with each breath. Diablo stumbled once, twice, but recovered, the horse's determination matching his rider's. When they finally reached the cabin, Jack dismounted with difficulty, his limbs stiff from cold and the long ride. He led Diablo to the lee side of the structure, offering what little protection it provided from the wind. Then, gathering his saddlebags and the bundle of firewood he'd managed to keep dry, he approached the door. The door swung open with a creak, and Jack stepped into darkness so complete he could barely make out shapes. As his eyes adjusted, he saw her, a woman standing before him, a rifle in her shaking hands. Behind her, 2 small forms huddled together on a bed, watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Stay back," the woman warned, her voice hoarse but determined. "I'll shoot." Jack slowly raised his hands, keeping his movements deliberate. "Ma'am, I'm not here to harm you. Name's Jack Calloway. I saw your cabin and thought you might need help." The rifle wavered, then lowered slightly. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Instead of answering, Jack set down his bundle of firewood and opened his saddlebag, revealing provisions, jerky, coffee, hardtack, and a small sack of flour. "Would a man looking to do you harm bring food?" The woman's eyes darted between his face and the supplies, suspicion warring with desperate need. Jack remained still, giving her time. He'd encountered fear before, knew how it could make people unpredictable. The last thing he wanted was to spook her into doing something they'd both regret. The sight of food broke something in Evelyn. The rifle clattered to the floor as her strength finally gave out. She would have fallen if Jack hadn't moved quickly to catch her, his strong arms keeping her upright. "Easy now," he murmured, guiding her to a chair. "Let me get a fire going first." With efficient movements born of years in the wilderness, Jack cleared the cold ashes from the hearth and built a new fire. His hands, though chapped and raw from the cold, worked with surprising gentleness. Soon, flames licked at the dry wood, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. The children watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination, especially Thomas, who had never seen anyone like Jack before. The man's scarred face and weathered appearance made him look like one of the outlaws from the dime novels Samuel used to read aloud. "Are you a bad man?" Thomas asked suddenly, his childish voice cutting through the silence. Jack paused, then continued feeding the fire. "No, son. Not bad. Just, lived a hard life." The boy considered this, his young mind processing the concept. "Did it hurt?" he asked, pointing to his own face to indicate Jack's scar. "Thomas." Evelyn admonished, embarrassment coloring her pale cheeks. "That's not polite." But Jack just nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Yes, it hurt. But pain teaches us things, if we're willing to learn." Once the fire was blazing, Jack set about preparing a simple meal. He melted snow for water, mixed flour into a rough dough for biscuits, and sliced jerky into a pot for a makeshift stew. The smell of cooking food filled the cabin, replacing the damp chill with something like hope. Evelyn insisted on helping despite her weakness, and together they worked in a silence that gradually became comfortable. When the food was ready, they gathered around the table, a family of strangers bound by circumstance. "Bow your heads," Evelyn said softly, and even Jack complied. "Thank you, Lord, for sending help when we needed it most. And thank you for this food. Amen." The children ate ravenously, color slowly returning to their pale cheeks. Evelyn took small bites, savoring each one, while Jack watched them all with an expression that was difficult to read. "My husband," Evelyn began, her voice steadier now. "He went to Cheyenne for supplies 3 weeks ago. The storm came early. I don't know if," she couldn't finish the sentence. Jack nodded, understanding what she couldn't say. "When the weather breaks, I'll look for him." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but the gratitude in her eyes made it impossible to say anything else. If this story has touched you so far, hit that like button. And if you know someone who's facing their own storm right now, share this video with them. Sometimes knowing others have survived impossible odds gives us the strength to keep fighting. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. During that time, Jack made himself indispensable. He reinforced the cabin walls, fixed the leaking roof, and fashioned a snow shovel from a broken barrel lid. Each morning, he dug a path to the lean-to where Diablo was sheltered, checking on the animal and bringing in more firewood from his saddlebags. Evelyn watched him with growing admiration. Jack was nothing like Samuel, where her husband had been talkative and full of dreams. Jack was quiet and practical. His hands were never idle, always finding something to fix or improve. And despite his intimidating appearance, he was gentle with the children, teaching Abigail how to tie special knots and showing Thomas how to whittle simple shapes from wood scraps. "Where did you learn all this?" Evelyn asked one evening as Jack mended a tear in Thomas's only pair of boots. Jack's hands stilled momentarily. "My father was a cobbler before he took to drinking. Some things you never forget." It was the first personal detail he'd shared, and Evelyn recognized it for the gift it was. On the 7th day, Thomas developed a cough that rattled in his small chest. By nightfall, he was burning with fever, his breathing labored. Evelyn's face went white with fear. She had lost her youngest brother to winter fever years ago and recognized the symptoms. "He needs medicine," she whispered to Jack, her voice breaking. "Without it." Jack nodded grimly. "I have some knowledge of herbs. If I can find what I need." The unspoken question hung between them, how? The storm still howled outside, making any journey potentially fatal. "I'll go at first light," Jack decided, his tone leaving no room for argument. Evelyn wanted to protest but knew there was no alternative. Instead, she spent the night bathing Thomas's forehead with cool cloths, praying as she hadn't prayed in years. As she tended to her son, Evelyn found herself talking, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. She told Jack about her childhood, about meeting Samuel, about the dreams that had brought them west and the reality that had slowly crushed those dreams. "I think I always knew he might not come back," she admitted, her voice barely audible over Thomas's labored breathing. "Not because he didn't love us, but because he couldn't face failing us again." Dawn brought no break in the weather, but Jack prepared to leave anyway. He wrapped himself in layers, securing a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible. "There's a stand of pine trees about a mile east," he told Evelyn. "If I'm lucky, I'll find what I need there. Keep the fire going. I'll be back before dark." Evelyn caught his arm as he turned to leave. "Why are you doing this? We're nothing to you." Jack's eyes, usually guarded, softened slightly. "Everyone's something to someone, Mrs. Hart." The journey was brutal. Each step required immense effort, the snow reaching Jack's thighs in places. The wind cut through his layers like they were nothing, and his face burned with cold despite the protection. But he pressed on, driven by the image of a small boy fighting for breath and a mother's desperate eyes. At the pine grove, Jack dug through snow until his fingers found what he sought: pine needles, pine resin, and beneath a fallen log, the dried remains of mullein plants. He gathered everything into a pouch, then began the arduous trek back. By the time Jack returned, Thomas's condition had worsened. The boy's breathing was shallow, his small body racked by coughing fits that left him exhausted. Abigail sat beside her brother, her young face solemn as she held his hand. Without wasting time, Jack set to work. He boiled water, added the pine needles and mullein, then mixed in a small amount of the precious honey he'd been saving. The cabin filled with a pungent, medicinal smell. "Help me sit him up," Jack instructed Evelyn. "He needs to drink as much of this as possible." Together, they coaxed the bitter liquid into Thomas, spoonful by painful spoonful. When the boy finally slept, his breathing slightly easier, Evelyn allowed herself to collapse into a chair. "Now we wait," Jack said quietly, his own exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. That night, as Thomas fought his battle, Jack and Evelyn kept vigil. In the flickering firelight, barriers began to fall. "The scar," Evelyn said softly, her eyes on his face. "How did it happen?" Jack's hand went to his face, fingers tracing the jagged line almost unconsciously. For a moment, Evelyn thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough with memory. "I rode with a man named Marcus Blackwood for 2 years. Thought he was my friend. We worked cattle drives together, shared food and fire. One night near Dodge City, he decided my horse and gear were worth more than my friendship. I woke to his knife at my throat." Evelyn's hand covered her mouth. "How did you survive?" A grim smile touched Jack's lips. "I didn't go down easy. The scar was his parting gift. Left me for dead, but a Cheyenne hunting party found me. Their medicine man saved my life." The story explained so much about Jack, his wariness, his self-reliance, his reluctance to accept gratitude. Trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. "And Samuel?" Jack asked after a while. "What kind of man is your husband?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "A dreamer. Always looking to the horizon, convinced something better was waiting. He loved us, in his way, but the frontier doesn't care about dreams," Jack finished for her. She nodded, the simple understanding between them more comforting than any words of false hope could have been. "We all carry scars, visible or hidden. They shape us, but they don't have to define us." Comment below if this story has made you think differently about the hardships you faced. On the 10th day, Thomas's fever broke. On the 11th, the storm finally relented, the howling wind dying to a whisper as patches of blue appeared in the sky. The world outside was transformed, familiar landmarks buried under feet of snow, trees bent under white burdens, the landscape alien and beautiful in its starkness. Jack knew it was time to fulfill his promise. With the weather clear, he could search for Samuel or news of him. Part of him dreaded what he might find, but Evelyn deserved the truth, whatever it might be. "I'll ride to Cheyenne," he told her as they stood in the doorway, watching the children venture cautiously into the snow. "Ask around about Samuel." Evelyn nodded, her face composed though her eyes betrayed her fear. "Thank you. For everything." Jack prepared to leave the next morning, packing provisions for the journey. As he saddled Diablo, Thomas ran up to him, something clutched in his small hand. "For you," the boy said, holding out a roughly carved wooden horse. "To remember us." Jack knelt, taking the gift with more care than he'd ever handled gold. "I won't need this to remember you, son. But I'll keep it close all the same." The journey to Cheyenne and back took 2 weeks. In that time, Evelyn and the children continued the work Jack had started, clearing snow, repairing damage from the storm, preparing for whatever the future might hold. Each day, Abigail would ask, "Is today when Mr. Jack comes back?" And each day, Evelyn would answer, "Maybe, sweetheart. We'll keep watching." When Jack finally appeared on the horizon, all three ran to meet him, their faces alight with joy that faltered when they saw his solemn expression. That evening, after the children were asleep, Jack told Evelyn what he had learned. Samuel had indeed reached Cheyenne, had even found work at a lumber mill. But he'd also found whiskey and cards, losing what little money he had. Ashamed to return empty-handed, he'd signed on with a cattle drive heading south to Texas. He wasn't coming back. Evelyn received the news with a stillness that worried Jack more than tears would have. "I think I've known for a while," she finally said. "Even before the storm." "What will you do now?" Jack asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. Evelyn looked around the cabin, the home she and Samuel had built, the place where her children had been born. "Stay. Fight. This is our home." Jack nodded, respect evident in his eyes. Then, hesitantly, he added, "You don't have to fight alone." The question hung unspoken between them, fragile as a snowflake. Evelyn met his gaze, seeing past the scar to the man beneath, a man who had risked everything for strangers, who had taught her children to laugh again, who looked at her not with pity but with admiration. "I'd welcome the company," she said softly. Spring would come to the frontier, as it always did. The snow would melt, revealing green shoots beneath. And in a small cabin that had weathered the worst winter in memory, a new family would take root, not bound by blood, but by something perhaps stronger, choice. The choice to stay, to trust, to begin again. Life's storms come without warning. They test us, break us, transform us. But sometimes, in the midst of our darkest hour, help arrives from unexpected places. And sometimes, what seems like an ending is merely the first page of a new chapter. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more tales from the American frontier. Share it with someone who needs reminding that even in our darkest moments, hope can find a way. Until next time, this is West Wild Tales, bringing history to life.